The autumn of 1847 had painted the countryside in shades of amber and crimson, but Lady Mary Thornfield saw none of its beauty as she stood before the altar of St. Margaret's Chapel. The Gothic arches seemed to loom over her like skeletal fingers, and the stained glass windows cast shadows that danced across her ivory silk gown like spectres of doubt. Her gloved hands trembled as she clutched her bouquet of white roses, their thorns pricking through the delicate fabric, a fitting metaphor for the matrimonial bonds she was about to enter. Beside her stood His Grace, Aldrich Blackwood, the 5th Duke of Ravenshollow, a man whose reputation preceded him like a winter storm. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, beautiful in its severity, but cold as the stone effigies that adorned his family's ancient tombs. His grey eyes, the color of storm clouds, had not once met hers during the ceremony, instead fixed on some distant point beyond the chapel walls, as if he were already planning his escape from this unwelcome union. The marriage had been arranged by their fathers, a business transaction disguised as a romantic alliance. The Earl of Thornfield needed the Duke's vast wealth to save his crumbling estate, while the Duke required a wife to satisfy the terms of his grandfather's will and secure his inheritance. It was a practical arrangement, devoid of sentiment or affection, exactly the sort of cold calculation that had made the Blackwood family one of the most powerful in England. As the rector's voice droned on about the sacred bonds of matrimony, Mary's thoughts drifted to her sister Isabella, who should have been standing in her place. Isabella, with her golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk and her cornflower blue eyes that sparkled with mischief and joy. Isabella, who had captured the Duke's attention at the midsummer ball 3 months prior, drawing him into animated conversation about Byron's poetry and the political upheavals sweeping across Europe. Isabella, who had fled to Scotland with a penniless artist the very week the betrothal contracts were to be signed, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled note and a scandal that threatened to destroy the Thornfield name. "Do you, Aldrich Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The rector's words cut through Mary's reverie like a blade. "I do." The Duke's voice was steady, emotionless, carrying no more warmth than if he were agreeing to purchase a horse or sign a business contract. Mary felt her heart sink further into her chest. She had harbored no illusions about this marriage, but the complete indifference in his tone struck her like a physical blow. When her own turn came to speak the binding words, her voice was barely above a whisper, lost in the vast emptiness of the chapel. The ceremony concluded with the exchange of rings, a heavy gold band that felt like a shackle around her finger, and a brief perfunctory kiss that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. His lips were cold against hers, and she caught the faintest scent of sandalwood and something darker, more mysterious, that seemed to cling to his skin like shadows. As they turned to face the small gathering of witnesses, mostly his relations, as her own family was too mortified by Isabella's scandal to attend in full number, the Duke offered her his arm with all the enthusiasm of a man walking to the gallows. Mary placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, feeling the solid strength of his arm beneath the fine wool of his coat, and together they walked down the aisle as husband and wife. The wedding breakfast at Ravenshollow Castle was a subdued affair. The Duke's ancestral home was a magnificent fortress that had stood for 6 centuries, its grey stone walls rising from the Yorkshire moors like something from a Gothic novel. The great hall where they dined was adorned with portraits of stern-faced ancestors and medieval tapestries that depicted scenes of battle and conquest. Even the autumn flowers that decorated the tables seemed to wilt under the oppressive atmosphere of the ancient stones. Mary found herself seated at the head table beside her new husband, who spoke only when directly addressed and spent most of the meal in brooding silence. The Duke's aunt, Lady Cordelia Blackwood, a formidable woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp black eyes, attempted to engage Mary in conversation about the running of the household, but even her efforts could not dispel the pall that hung over the celebration. "The Duchess's chambers have been prepared in the East Wing," Lady Cordelia informed Mary as the final course was served. "They have not been occupied since the Duke's mother passed, but the staff has seen to their renovation. I trust you will find them adequate." Mary nodded politely, though the thought of sleeping in rooms that had belonged to a dead woman filled her with unease. She had heard whispers about the Duke's mother, Lady Evangeline Blackwood, who had died in childbirth when Aldrich was born. Some said her ghost still walked the corridors of Raven's Hollow, searching for the son who had cost her life. As the afternoon wore on and the last of the wedding guests departed, Mary found herself alone with her husband in the castle's library, a vast room lined with leather-bound volumes from floor to ceiling. The Duke stood before the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, staring into the flames as if they held the secrets of the universe. The firelight played across his angular features, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw and the aristocratic slope of his nose. He was undeniably handsome, Mary admitted to herself, but it was a cold beauty, like a sculpture crafted by a master artist but lacking the warmth of life. "Your Grace," Mary began tentatively, unsure how to address this stranger who was now her husband. He turned at the sound of her voice, and for the first time that day his grey eyes met hers directly. There was something in his gaze, pain, perhaps, or regret, that made her breath catch in her throat. "Aldrich," he corrected quietly, "you are my wife now. The formalities seem rather pointless, don't you think?" Mary felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Aldrich, then, I wanted to thank you for doing your duty today. I know this marriage was not of your choosing." A bitter smile curved his lips. "Duty. Yes, that seems to be the word that governs both our lives now, doesn't it?" He moved away from the fireplace, walking to one of the tall windows that looked out over the moors. The landscape beyond was wild and desolate, stretching endlessly toward the horizon where storm clouds gathered like an army preparing for battle. "I should be honest with you, Mary," he said, his back still turned to her. "I had hoped, that is, I had expected to marry another. Your sister, to be precise." The words hung in the air between them like a sword waiting to fall. Mary felt as though all the air had been sucked from her lungs, leaving her gasping and struggling to breathe. "I desired your sister only," he continued, his voice matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of grain. Isabella was vibrant, passionate, alive in a way that few people are. When I learned of her elopement, I confess I felt more relief than disappointment at first. I thought perhaps I could escape this unwelcome alliance entirely. Mary sank into one of the leather chairs beside the fireplace, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The white roses in her bouquet, which she still carried, seemed to mock her with their pristine beauty. She had known, of course, that Isabella had caught the Duke's eye, but hearing him speak of it so openly, so cruelly, was like having her heart carved from her chest with a dull blade. "But my grandfather's will is quite specific," Aldrich continued, finally turning to face her. "I must marry a woman of noble birth before my 30th birthday, or forfeit the bulk of the Blackwood fortune to a distant cousin who would undoubtedly run the estates into the ground within a decade. Your father was persuasive in his arguments that you would make a suitable substitute for your wayward sister." "A substitute," Mary repeated, her voice barely audible. The word tasted bitter on her tongue. "I want you to understand that this is not a reflection of your worth as a person," Aldrich said, though his tone remained distant and clinical. "You seem intelligent, well-bred, pleasant enough to look upon. Under different circumstances, I'm sure you would make some fortunate gentleman a perfectly adequate wife. But I cannot pretend to feel for you what I felt for Isabella, and I believe it would be cruel to both of us to attempt such a deception." Mary stared at him, speechless. She had expected indifference, perhaps even coldness, but this brutal honesty was somehow worse than either. To know that every time he looked at her, he would see only the shadow of her sister, the pale reflection of the woman he truly desired. It was a torture she had not anticipated. "I see," she managed at last, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil raging in her chest. "And what, precisely, do you propose we do with this knowledge?" Aldrich moved to his desk, a massive piece of carved oak that had belonged to generations of Blackwood dukes before him. He poured himself a measure of brandy from a crystal decanter, but did not offer her any, a small oversight that spoke volumes about his state of mind. "We will maintain the appearance of a proper marriage," he said after taking a sip of the amber liquid. "You will serve as my hostess when the social calendar requires it, and you will have complete freedom to pursue whatever interests occupy your time: reading, needlework, charitable works, whatever occupies ladies of your station. In return, I will ensure that you are provided for in every material sense, that you have all the comforts and luxuries befitting a duchess." "And what of children?" Mary asked, though the words seemed to stick in her throat. "Surely your grandfathers will require an heir?" Something flickered across Aldrich's face, embarrassment, perhaps, or discomfort at the indelicate nature of the subject. "In time, yes. When we have both adjusted to our circumstances, we will need to address that obligation. But there is no immediate urgency." Mary felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Even in this most intimate aspect of their marriage, she was to be treated as nothing more than a duty to be discharged when convenient. She stood abruptly, the roses in her bouquet scattering petals across the Persian carpet. "If you will excuse me," she said with as much dignity as she could muster, "I believe I should retire to my chambers. It has been a long day." Aldrich nodded curtly. "Lady Cordelia will show you to your rooms. The servants have been instructed to attend to your every need. If there is anything you require, you need only ask Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper." Mary walked toward the library door on unsteady legs, each step feeling like she was walking through quicksand. As she reached for the brass handle, Aldrich's voice stopped her. "Mary!" She turned, hope flickering foolishly in her heart that he might offer some word of comfort, some acknowledgment that their situation was painful for them both. "I am truly sorry," he said quietly. "You deserve better than this. Better than me." The sincerity in his voice was somehow worse than his earlier cruelty. Mary nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, and fled from the library before the tears that threatened could fall. The Duchess's chambers in the East Wing were indeed magnificent, though their splendor felt hollow and unwelcoming. The bedroom was dominated by a massive four-poster bed hung with burgundy velvet curtains, and tall windows looked out over the castle's rose garden. A sitting room adjoined the bedroom, furnished with delicate pieces that seemed feminine and romantic, clearly chosen by a woman who had expected to find happiness in these rooms. Lady Cordelia had departed after ensuring that Mary's trunks had been unpacked and her belongings properly arranged, leaving her alone with her thoughts for the first time since the morning. Mary dismissed her lady's maid, needing solitude more than assistance, and sank into a chair by the window. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as darkness fell, sending sheets of rain against the glass and howling wind around the castle's ancient stones. Mary watched the lightning illuminate the moors in brief, stark flashes, thinking that the weather perfectly matched her internal tempest. She had known this marriage would be difficult, but she had not expected her husband to be quite so honest about his feelings, or lack thereof. Most men in arranged marriages, she had assumed, would at least make an effort at politeness, if not genuine affection. But Aldrich Blackwood was not most men. He was a duke who had grown accustomed to speaking his mind without consideration for others' feelings, secure in his power and position. And yet there had been something in his eyes when he apologized, something that suggested his coldness was not entirely natural to him. Mary found herself wondering what had shaped him into the man he was, whether it was losing his mother at birth, growing up in this vast, lonely castle, or simply the weight of ducal responsibilities that had hardened his heart. Over the following weeks, Mary began to establish a routine at Ravenshollow Castle. She rose early to walk in the gardens, spent her mornings reading in the library or writing letters, and devoted her afternoons to learning about the management of the vast estate. Lady Cordelia proved to be an invaluable guide, teaching her about the household accounts, the tenant farmers, and the social obligations that came with her new position. Aldrich remained politely distant, joining her for dinner each evening but speaking little beyond the necessities of courtesy. He spent most of his days in his study, managing business affairs or riding across the estate on his massive black stallion, a creature as dark and temperamental as its master. Sometimes Mary would watch from her window as he galloped across the moors, his riding coat billowing behind him like the wings of some great bird of prey. It was during one of these solitary observations that Mary began to notice subtle changes in her husband's behavior. At dinner, she caught him studying her face when he thought she wasn't looking, his gray eyes holding an expression she couldn't quite decipher. He began asking about her activities, showing interest in the books she was reading or the charitable projects she was considering. The changes were small, almost imperceptible, but they gave Mary the first glimmer of hope she had felt since their wedding day. The breakthrough came on a particularly wild November evening when Mary was walking through the portrait gallery, studying the faces of Aldrich's ancestors. She had developed a fascination with the family history, finding stories of passion and tragedy that seemed to echo through the generations. She paused before a portrait of a beautiful woman with dark hair and sad eyes, wearing the style of dress popular in the previous century. "That was my great-grandmother, Lady Miriam Blackwood," Aldrich's voice came from behind her, causing Mary to startle. She had not heard his approach over the wind that rattled the windows. "She's beautiful," Mary said, turning to face him. He wore no jacket, only a white shirt open at the collar, and his dark hair was disheveled as if he had been running his hands through it. "She looks melancholy, though." "She was," Aldrich replied, moving to stand beside her before the portrait. "She was married to my great-grandfather against her will, in love with another man who was deemed unsuitable by her family. She spent most of her married life writing poetry and letters that were never sent, pouring her heart onto paper because she couldn't speak it aloud." Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November wind. How terrible for her, to be trapped in such a way. "Yes," Aldrich said quietly. "I used to stare at this portrait as a child, wondering what thoughts lay behind those sad eyes. Lady Cordelia told me stories about her, how she would walk the moors at night, talking to the wind as if it were the lover she could never have." They stood in silence for a long moment, both lost in contemplation of the tragic figure in the painting. Finally Aldrich spoke again, his voice so low that Mary had to strain to hear it over the storm. "I fear I have made you equally miserable, Mary. That was never my intention." Mary's heart began to race. This was the first time since their wedding day that he had spoken to her with anything approaching genuine emotion. "I am not miserable," she said carefully. "Lonely, perhaps, but not miserable." Aldrich turned to look at her then, really look at her, as if seeing her for the first time. In the flickering candlelight of the gallery, his harsh features seemed softer, more vulnerable. "You are nothing like I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "A pale copy of Isabella. A shy, simpering creature who would fade into the background and make no demands upon my attention." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. "But you are not pale at all, are you? You have your own strength, your own beauty. I have been blind." Mary felt her breath catch. "Aldrich." "I have been thinking," he continued, as if the words were being torn from him against his will, "about duty and desire and the difference between the two. I married you out of duty, yes, but perhaps duty need not be the enemy of happiness." "What are you saying?" He moved closer to her, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood scent that always seemed to cling to his skin, could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "I am saying that I would like to try to be a proper husband to you. Not because my grandfather's will demands it, but because you deserve nothing less than a man's full attention and respect." Mary stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "And Isabella?" Pain flickered across his features. "Isabella is married to her artist, living whatever life she has chosen for herself. She exists now only in memory, and memories make poor companions for the living." He reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against her cheek with surprising gentleness. "You are here, Mary. You are real and warm, and far more remarkable than I gave you credit for. If you would permit me, I would like to learn who you truly are." Tears sprang to Mary's eyes, not tears of sorrow, as she had shed so many in recent weeks, but tears of relief and something that might, in time, become joy. "I would like that very much," she whispered. Aldrich's stern mouth curved into the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, transforming his entire face. "Then perhaps we might begin again, you and I, start fresh, as if this were our first meeting rather than a marriage built on the ashes of another's choosing. How does one begin again after vows have been spoken and rings exchanged?" "Like this," he said, and leaned down to kiss her. Not the brief, cold touch of lips that had marked their wedding ceremony, but a real kiss, warm and searching and full of promise. Mary felt something long frozen in her chest begin to thaw, like ice melting under the first rays of spring sunshine. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. Aldrich rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face with a tenderness she had not known he possessed. "Will you walk with me tomorrow?" he asked. "I would like to show you the estate, not as a duchess learning her duties, but as my wife, my companion. There are places here that I think you would appreciate, wild and beautiful spots that few people ever see." "Yes," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I would like that very much." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the moors like a blanket of diamonds. Mary dressed in her warmest riding habit, a deep blue wool that Lady Cordelia had commissioned from London, and met Aldrich in the stables. He had saddled a gentle mare for her, a pretty chestnut creature with kind eyes and a sweet temperament. "Her name is Melody," Aldrich said, helping Mary mount. "She belonged to my mother, or so Lady Cordelia tells me. She's getting on in years now, but she still loves a good ride across the countryside." They set out together, riding at an easy pace across the wild landscape that surrounded Ravenshollow Castle. Aldrich proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his childhood explorations. He showed her the ruins of an ancient abbey, its stone walls crumbling but still beautiful in their decay, and a hidden valley where wildflowers bloomed in spring and a crystal-clear stream wound between moss-covered rocks. As they rode, Mary found herself seeing glimpses of the man Aldrich might have been without the weight of ducal responsibility and family tragedy pressing down upon him. He laughed at her startled reaction when a rabbit darted across their path, and his eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm when he spoke about plans to improve the tenant cottages and expand the estate's charitable works. "You have a good heart," Mary observed as they paused to rest the horses beside the stream. "I think perhaps you hide it too well." Aldrich dismounted and helped her down from Melody's back, his hands lingering at her waist longer than strictly necessary. "I learned early that showing weakness, or what my father considered weakness, only led to disappointment and pain. It seemed safer to keep such feelings locked away. And now—" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the water where fallen leaves swirled in lazy circles. "Now I find myself wondering if safety is worth the price I've paid for it. What good is a heart that never risks being broken?" Mary moved closer to him, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice. "Perhaps the risk is worth taking, if the reward is great enough." He turned to look at her then, his gray eyes intense and searching. "Do you think we might find such a reward together, Mary? Despite the unfortunate beginning to our union?" "I think," Mary said carefully, "that love built on understanding and respect might prove more lasting than love born of passion alone. Passion fades, but companionship, true partnership, those things can grow stronger with time." Aldrich reached for her hand, intertwining their gloved fingers. "You are wise beyond your years. I begin to think your father's choice of replacement daughter was more astute than I initially credited." Mary laughed despite herself. "What a romantic thing to say, Your Grace. You certainly know how to sweep a lady off her feet." "Forgive me," Aldrich said, though he was smiling now. I fear I am out of practice with romantic speeches. Perhaps you could teach me? Perhaps, Mary replied, her heart lifting at the playful tone in his voice. Though I think actions may speak louder than words. As if accepting her challenge, Aldrich lifted their joined hands to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was simple, almost chaste, but the warmth in his eyes made it feel like the most intimate of caresses. The weeks that followed brought a gradual but unmistakable change in their relationship. Aldrich began joining Mary for her morning walks in the garden, and she would sit with him in his study during the evenings, reading quietly while he attended to correspondence. They discovered shared interests, a love of history, a concern for the welfare of the estate's tenants, an appreciation for the wild beauty of the Yorkshire landscape. More importantly, they began to talk, really talk, about their thoughts, fears, and dreams. Mary learned that Aldrich's coldness stemmed not from lack of feeling, but from too much feeling carefully suppressed. He had loved his father deeply despite the man's harshness, had grieved for the mother he had never known, had carried the weight of family expectations since childhood. In turn, Mary shared her own struggles, the pain of always being compared to beautiful, vivacious Isabella, the loneliness of being the quiet, scholarly sister in a family that valued charm and social graces above intellectual pursuits. She told him about her secret writing, the poetry she penned in the early morning hours when the castle was still asleep and her thoughts could roam free. "Would you share some of your verses with me?" Aldrich asked one evening as they sat before the fire in the library. "I promise to be a kind critic." Mary blushed furiously. "Oh, I couldn't. They're not very good, and they're rather personal." "All the more reason I should like to hear them," he said gently. "I want to know you, Mary, all of you, including the thoughts you commit to paper when no one is watching." Something in his tone, tender and encouraging, gave Mary the courage to retrieve her small leather journal from her chambers. She returned to find Aldrich waiting patiently, his attention entirely focused on her as she settled beside him on the sofa. "This one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wrote it last week after our ride to the Abbey ruins." She cleared her throat and began to read, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "In ancient stones where prayers once rose, like incense to the morning sky, I found a peace that few now know, a truth that time cannot deny. What mortal hearts have built may fall, what passionate words may fade away, but love that grows from nothing, small, and tender shoots that strengthen each day, may prove more lasting than the stone that crumbles now beneath the rain, more faithful than the hearts that moan. For passion's fire and passion's pain, give me not love like summer's storm, but like the steady northern star, constant, quiet, true, and warm, a guide no distance makes less fair." When she finished, Mary could not bring herself to look at Aldrich, terrified of what she might see in his eyes. The poem was too revealing, too honest about her growing feelings for him and her hope that their marriage might become something real and lasting. "Mary," his voice was rough with emotion, "look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to his face and saw there an expression of wonder and something deeper, warmer than she had dared hope for. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "And you are wrong about your writing not being very good. You have captured something there, something I have been feeling but could not put into words." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering immediately, he reached for her hands, holding them gently in his larger ones. "I mean that I find myself caring for you, Mary, not as a substitute for another, not as a duty to be discharged, but as yourself, brave, intelligent, kind Mary who sees beauty in ruins and writes poetry about lasting love." Mary's heart began to race. "Aldrich, I know it is too soon to speak of love," he continued, his thumbs stroking over her knuckles. "We have known each other truly for only a few weeks, and the wounds from our wedding day still ache for us both. But I feel, something growing between us, something that might indeed prove more lasting than passion's fire. Mary felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of happiness, of hope finally fulfilled. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I have felt it growing stronger each day." Aldrich leaned closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "Then perhaps, my dear wife, we might speak of love soon. Perhaps we might find that duty and desire need not be enemies, but allies in building something beautiful together." This time, when he kissed her, Mary kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion of the past months. She tasted hope on his lips, felt the promise of future happiness in the gentle strength of his arms as they encircled her. When they parted, both were breathless and flushed, staring at each other with a mixture of wonder and dawning passion. "Mary," Aldrich said, his voice hoarse, "my dear, beloved Mary, I think I am beginning to understand what love truly means." "And what is that?" she asked, her hand coming up to trace the strong line of his jaw. "It means choosing someone every day, not just in the heat of passion but in the quiet moments between. It means seeing all of who they are and cherishing every part, even the broken pieces. It means building something together that neither of you could create alone." Mary felt her heart overflow with joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh yes, that is exactly what love means." Outside, the November wind howled around the ancient stones of Ravenshollow Castle, but inside the library, beside the warmth of the fire, two souls found in each other the thing they had both been seeking without knowing it, not the wild passion of first attraction, but something deeper, more lasting, more true. The Duke, who had declared he desired only her sister, now held Mary as if she were the most precious thing in the world, and she knew with absolute certainty that their love, born of understanding and nurtured by respect, would indeed prove more enduring than summer storms. In the portrait gallery, Lady Miriam Blackwood seemed to smile down from her gilded frame, as if blessing this new chapter in the family's long history, a chapter that would be written not in sorrow and regret, but in joy and hope and the quiet triumph of two hearts that had found their perfect match in each other.